So let's first understand what a database is, right? So this is a common definition of a database. So a database is a structural collection of data. So this is very important. So it is basically a structured collection of data which is organized, stored, and managed to facilitate efficient data storage and retrieval and manipulation. All right. So now we'll break this down into simple things as well. So don't worry about it. So this is basically the basic definition of a database that you will find in the internet, right? It serves as a central repository for storing and organizing information in a way that is easy for access, retrieval, and analysis. But let me break it down into very simple things with a proper use case. Okay, very simple use case I will talk about. So we all have phone, right? So we have phone that we use it for variety of reasons, right? So basically a phone, let's say if you want to store something in the phone, let's say you want to store somebody's contact information, right? So you will have a name for that person. So you will have a first name, last name, company, date of birth, the phone number, all this information, right? So now what you will do is you will open your phone and kind of feed all this information, and then you will save it. So internally, what happens is all this information is saved in the phone's database, right? So this is basically the storage, correct? So we are storing the data in the database. So here also in the definition, you can see like this is for storage database. Now, once you store the database, right? Once you store the data in the database, why is it necessary for us to store? So that we can retrieve it at some other point, right? So let's for example, if I want to make a call to a person called as John, right? And so what I'll do is I'll open my phone directory and I will search for John, or if I know the phone number, I can search with the phone number as well, right? And then it will show me the particular person's number, and if whatever I want to retrieve, if I want to look at the date of birth of that person, or if I want to look at the last name of that person or the company of that person, then I can get that information. So this is basically retrieving this information. So you store the data and then you retrieve this information. So this is where the database is very helpful. And there are other things like you can do an analysis. Like for example, if I open a particular phone number, I can look at how many times I have called that person, right? So it gives you a count when I call that person, what is the duration of that call. All this kind of analysis and everything can be done using a database. So that is why database is very, very important. You can store this data in the database and then you can retrieve the data in the database. So this is a very basic example of how the data is stored, or the example of a database, right? Now, you may also ask a question, okay, why can't we do this in other things like, for example, Excel, right? You can store this data in Excel, but the problem with such applications is that as the data increases, the volume of the data increases, then it will slow down the performance. And also, those things will have limitations and everything. So, that is why we actually prefer a database, because we can organize them. We can organize the data and we can efficiently retrieve this data, right? So, there are multiple advantages of storing this data in the database. Like you can store and manage large amount of data, like you can store millions and billions of data into the database, and the data that is stored is pretty much accurate. It stays accurate unless you are updating it, and then easily updatable. So for example, if John has changed the phone number, right? So what I can do is I can search for John, gives me all the details of John, and then I can go to the phone number section. I can update this data. So I can update the phone number. So it is that easy for us to actually update this data. And the data integrity, it may ensures that the data is not corrupted, and then only the data whatever that you have fed, it remains the same. It does not change unless you change it, right? So that integrity is also maintained. Then security, right? So if you look at phone, you will have your pin number, or you'll have a thumb impression. So similar in the database, what we have is not everybody will have access to the database. You need to have a user ID, you need to have a password to actually access the database. And also within the database, we have so many other objects which can only be accessed. You'll have a special permissions required for each of this. Again, all these things we will see as we progress through the course, but the data is basically secure, right? So that is one of the major things why we are using a database, and easy to query data, right? So Again, this is something that we will see throughout the course, how easy it is to actually query the data, whatever we want. So we use something called as SQL to query the data. So basically, these are the advantages of the database. Next, what we'll do is like we'll also look at some other important concepts, and so we have something called as a relational database. So before that, these are basically the different types of databases that we have. We have relational database, object-oriented, NoSQL, graph, hierarchical, document, time series. These are all the different types of database. Each has a specific use case, right? So in this course, what we're going to look at is we're going to look at the relational database, which is basically the traditional database. All the other databases actually come after the relational database. So once you are good with the relational database, it's very easy for you to kind of jump into the other databases. All right. So these are basically the different databases. Now, what we'll do is you have something called as database, right? So let's say this is basically your database. All right. Now, within the database, we talked about, okay, you if you have to connect to this database, you need a username and password. So generally what happens is this database is hosted in some server. Okay, so the server could be any data center, or it could be on the clouds anywhere, right? It could also be in the local system, but generally, I mean, for our use case, for our course, we will host this database into our local system. But for production, like if you are working in a company and everything, they generally host it over cloud, or they host it over some other place, right? Data center, right? They can host it in a data center. So now you have the database here. So in order to access this database, you need to have something called as a client. So you need to have a client tool. So now within this client, you will use a username and password, and then you will basically, if the password and username are correct, then you will be able to access this database. So this is basically the client server architecture. So your database will be in the server side, and you will have a client tool where you will log in and access the data in the database. So all these steps will come step by step. Now within this database, we talked about like, okay, the data is basically stored, correct? So the data is stored in the database. Okay, so we have a database here. Now, we also saw that the data is kind of organized. Okay, so this is very important. So basically, what we have is within the database, we have something called as schema. So schema basically organizes all your data. So for example, within a company, they may have something related to sales. They may have something related to the customer department, right? So they may have different kind of departments. Okay. So there might be sales department, there may be customer department. So what they will do is basically they will create a schema for sales. They will create a schema for customers. So all the data that is related to the sales, just the sales will be into one schema. All the data related to the customer will be into another schema. This is basically organizing the data. So it's basically like if all the data related to one, you put it into one folder in your computer. The data related to something else, you put into another folder. So similar like that, you will actually have like a schema. You can, if you want to relate it with your computer, you can say it's kind of a folder, right? So within the schema, we have something called as tables and other objects, and the tables are basically where you store the actual data. The data will be stored in the tables will be part of the schema will be part of the database. So this is basically the hierarchy at a very very high level. Okay, now within our course, we will talk about the relational database, right? So this is basically how a relational database looks like. Okay, now if I want to talk about tables, right, in their or relational database. So relational database has tables. This is where our data is stored, right? How the data is stored? Data is stored in rows and columns. All right. So let me draw this. So basically, these horizontal lines are basically rows, and the vertical lines are called as columns. So columns basically tells to you what kind of data it is. So for example, in this column, I can store all the ID values. So 1, 2, 3. So this particular column, which is ID, stores the values 1, 2, 3. So now I can tell you like, okay, this column shows all the identity values. Now there might be another column name. Here I can store all the names. So John, Smith, right? Now, what is happening here is like I have a column called as ID, which stores all the data related to that ID, sorry, related to the identity. I have another column name, which stores the names. All right. So maybe I can store the department number 10, 20, 30. So these are basically columns, right? ID, name, columns. Now, what is row? So this is basically a row. This is basically a row. This is basically a row. So row basically talks about the information, right? So this particular, so this might be an employee data. So this basically talks about the employee. So this row has a ID one. So the ID one, that person name is John, and John is basically in the department number 10. So this is at the row level. So now if I want to understand, if I want to retrieve the information, all the information of John, then I need to retrieve that information in this row. So this is how you get. But if I may also want to just retrieve ID and name of John, so I can say like I'll basically have ID and name of John, right? And again, if this is confusing, don't worry. We do have further details. We will detail how you can retrieve all this information and everything. But for now, just understand that we store the data in table, and table is basically consists of rows and columns. So this is basically how we store the data. So this is this is a row, and these are basically your columns. So and we use something called as SQL to kind of connect to the database to retrieve this information. All right. So now the data is stored here in the database, right? So again, data is stored in your tables. Now, how do we store this data in the database, right? So you need to communicate to the database, right? So we use something called as SQL, structured query language, to communicate to the database to insert the data, right? Storing, which basically storing this data. And we use the same SQL to kind of retrieve this data. So we store, we insert the data, we retrieve the data using SQL. So this is basically the overall of what database is, why the database is important, and how the database is organized. Like you have database schema, within the schema you have tables. Tables is where you actually store this database, and then SQL to kind of retrieve the data from the database. So this is the introductory section, and we'll follow with the more examples coming in the next lectures. But I hope this is clear to you guys, and I'll see you guys in my next class.